So I have a couple of threads here that I want to show you all. The Copaganda by Alec Karakatsanis, whose work I show quite regularly. So this is Alec. He had two threads, both within the last week or so, on the New York Times and how they cover crime and how they exploit coverage of crime to do what he calls Copaganda, pro-police propaganda. So really encourage you all to follow him, Equality Alec on Twitter. He really sheds light on how the media operates when it comes to manufacturing consent for police abuse and ensuring that their budgets stay high and all that kind of stuff. So really great work. Thread: a new scandal is brewing at the New York Times. I try my best below to document the paper's corporate and police union propaganda and to share actual evidence and research that the New York Times ignores. The stakes are huge. Last year, I wrote about a New York Times writer who didn't disclose he had worked for the CIA, Palantir, and police, or that he currently ran a consulting company that relies on law enforcement contracts. It was shocking, unethical episode. Well, today, New York Times had different reporter write basically the same story and send it to the entire New York Times email list, who was his main data source. Quote, the same CIA, Palantir, police analyst, or I'm sorry, those are stars. Again, the New York Times calls that guy a crime analyst without reporting any of his conflicts of interest. Today's piece is in many ways worse. It is unethical, faux science, suggesting that more police will make us safer. This is contrary to the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence, but you wouldn't know that from the New York Times. But it gets even more insidious. I've done a meta thread with relevant scientific papers and essays to explain why articles like this about more cops mean more safety are asking all the wrong questions and misleading you about even the silly questions that they are asking. While premise of today's article is nonsense, I want to make a few points. First, there is little new reporting. This is essentially the same talking points the New York Times published last year. When looking at the media, we ask who benefits from repeatedly making this news. Second, most of the main factual claims in the article have no citation. They are highly controversial, in many cases disproven opinions published in the paper of record without telling readers they are even contested. Ask why the reporter doesn't want us to even know that. Third, the paper cites undisclosed experts for the idea that there are only 3 possible explanations for rising murders. What? Which experts? Why isn't the real big issue mentioned? And he shows a thread here. I'll read this part. One enduring truth you don't hear police mention when they talk about crime waves is this: violence is higher in countries that are more unequal, and violence is higher in the United States, U.S. states, that are more unequal. So this, obviously, we talk about this a lot, you guys. If you want to solve crime, provide good social services for the people, right? This is it's a it's a societal issue. It's not this, you can't just put it in a vacuum and discuss it as though but that's exactly what the New York Times and other major papers and media outlets do. Carrying on here. Fourth, there are 2 main experts offered to give vague support for the article's main thesis, that changes in policing caused murder and that the solutions are more punishment. The first source is a guy who pro-police journalists always seem to quote for the James Comey Ferguson effect idea in articles that don't offer any evidence, just his opinion. And PR used the same guy for the same reason. His opinion here is impossibly vague. The Ferguson effect, suggesting that reaction by police and public to civil rights protests somehow increases crime, is like climate science denial. It was laughed at when Comey suggested it, and now it's offered as fancy pseudoscience in the New York Times. The second source asserts he is, quote, as much a reformer as anybody, but then asserts with no evidence that there's no getting around that the short-term solution is more punishment. The actual science says the exact opposite, but the New York Times doesn't tell you that. One of the most subtle forms of propaganda is the choice of who counts as an expert. Why did the New York Times quote these experts, but not the array of scientists who have the opposite view, that more police makes us less safe compared to reducing inequality and other investments? Another form of propaganda is the intentional decision to portray some kind of expert consensus by ignoring all the experts who disagree. One of the most subtle ways to mislead readers is to say experts say, but then only report one side of a hotly contested expert debate. Fifth, though all credible criminologists know it's irresponsible to speculate on causes of short-term fluctuations in crime, the New York Times attempts to explain estimated murder trends and even suggests the pandemic likely isn't responsible, but changes in police policing are. Wild speculation. So notice, you guys, like, the reflex is to assume whatever's in the favor of police. So no, it's not the pandemic. We know that, right? And Alec rightly points out it's pretty wild to speculate about short-term fluctuations anyway, because you have such a small sample size. But notice the reflex. It's always in the direction of police need more funding, police need more funding. Only other support offered for pro-police union ideas that we need more police to make us safer is a link to the same reporter's prior opinion piece in Vox. I demolished those ideas and even spoke to him. He had no answer to any of my arguments. It is difficult to capture how bleak it is for the leading news source in the country at a time of rising fascism to be pushing faux science, suggesting the U.S. needs even more spending on militarized police surveillance and punishment. It will have historic consequences. Setting aside the evidence in my thread above that police cause more crime than they prevent and instead use their budgets to brutally enforce inequality, every other comparable country in the world manages to have lower violence and less punishment. All that is missing in the New York Times. To be clear, you guys, a lot of countries very imperfect on law enforcement, but this point is a profound one. The gap between how bad we are about law enforcement and how bad other countries are is a very large gap for the most part. Okay, so you can go find egregious examples of law enforcement abuse in a lot of countries around the world. With us, it's just so much more constant. It's happening all the time. So that point is really profound to me. This is unfortunately part of a long pattern of similar unethical, dangerous reporting in the New York Times. Below are a few of the many threads I've done recently collecting some of these examples. At a time of rising authoritarian movements, we cannot let this keep happening. And as you can see here, he posts a bunch more threads, some of which I'm sure I've brought to the show, and others I encourage you all to go read. And I have a second one here. This is also Alec on the New York Times. This one from yesterday. That other one was from a few days ago. Thread. I noticed something fascinating. Around the same time in recent days, each major corporate news source began talking about a new crime hysteria, a supposed crisis of theft from the railroad industry. But if you look deeper, something very scary is happening. For context, recall I outlined an incredible coordination between corporate police PR departments and corporate media reporters around retail theft. Here's a thread I wrote about how the same words, sources, and phrases began appearing everywhere at once. He cites his thread there. For the railroad story, I'll start with the New York Times story because it is arguably the most reputable news source and because it is one of the most dangerous and irresponsible articles. Here's the story. As I've shown time and again with the New York Times, if you just go through their stories and list the sources relied on, it becomes obvious who is, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to click on that. It becomes obvious who is influencing the news and how it is framed. This is a list of the story's sources in chronological order, and it's astonishing. Quote, authorities, an LAPD captain, the police, LAPD captain twice more, Railroad Corporation twice, Railroad Corporation spokesperson, Association of American Railroads, LAPD captain, assistant professor of marketing, Railroad Corporation, railroad spokesperson, DA, LAPD captain 5 more times to close the article out. So they're talking to police and corporations, and they're acting as though that is somehow an objective set of sources to use for an article. Imagine being a reporter at the most influential, prestigious news organization in the United States and writing a major story at a time of rising fascism and just repeating police and corporate talking points about needing more punishment without seeking a single other perspective. Incredible. In typical New York Times fashion, cops made wild claims with no evidence or scrutiny. It all leads up to big moment. The last 5 paragraphs of the piece, all given to the LAPD, give away the game. This is about more dollars for cops. Quote, they are really trying, but we are all understaffed, he said. This reminds me, just a brief anecdote here. This reminds me of how an LAPD precinct was closed and there was a sheet of paper on the door that said, hey, sorry, we're closed, but it's because we've been defunded. Out and out lie on both fronts. They have not been defunded, and the reason they were closed is because so many cops had COVID and couldn't come to work. So like how brazen can you possibly be in your lies and your deceit and your attempt to sway public opinion in your favor? It's pathetic, you guys. It's pitiful. Like if they weren't able to be violent to people and oppress impoverished communities and racial minorities, it would be pitiful and hilarious and pathetic and laughable. But because they go around killing people instead of just the clownish stuff, it's this horrific horrific, setup and system. But the way cops behave, you guys, is they're like toddlers. Like, honestly, on some level, I actually pity how immature they really are, and how servile they are to the imperialist violent mentality and this fascist mentality that Alec is talking about. It's really quite, I don't know, it's an indictment on our species that people behave as cops do, right? Carrying on. What does New York Times omit? That the LAPD already has an astonishing $3 billion budget, most of it spent on low-level traffic, drugs, homelessness, mental illness related stuff, and that the LAPD is in the midst of big budget fight trying to get a 12% increase. 12% increase on $3 billion, you guys. And by the way, it was Alec who brought to my attention that something around 3% of police budgets actually go to violent crime. So don't mistake that as being $3 billion that's there to stop murderers. It's nothing of the sort. It's, as he listed there, homelessness, mental illness related stuff, drugs, low-level traffic stuff, etc. New York Times also omits one of the most crucial facts you need to know. The LAPD and LA Sheriff together have 67 full-time employees working on PR and propaganda, you guys. 67 propaganda artists working for the LAPD and the LA Sheriff. It's unbelievable. People don't realize that they spend a lot of money and time to plant these stories. Yeah, how much of that $3 billion is paying those 67, huh? And giving them resources. But I digress. This story began with a letter from railroad monopoly lobbyists complaining about not enough human caging by quote-unquote progressive LA prosecutor. I am gravely disappointed to see what has come there. I'm blanking on the guy's name, but like a year or so ago, I remember when he won that seat, and he had a lot of good noises to make about progressive reform in the DA's office, and I was encouraged to see him win such a, it's LA County. It's like a huge populace there, right? I was like encouraged, and he turned around and has essentially done the opposite, unfortunately. Almost immediately, and we don't yet know how, a pro-cop CBS reporter took a viral video of tracks that corporate police boosted. A lot of actually thinking people, and he cites a few there, immediately noticed some suspicious things about the organized train robbery story, including some potential vendettas and corporate insurance games. The vague, dubious story was quickly picked up by CBS, Fox, NBC, ABC, and many more through a vast web of police corporate PR efforts. If you look at all these stories, you'll see a lot of the same turns of phrases, sources, and claims. As always, it's quickly seized on by pro-fascist groups and corporate Democrats to argue for more money for police, more profitable surveillance, prosecution, and human caging. The corporate media portray the railroad monopoly Union Pacific as some kind of helpless victim overrun by organized groups of homeless thieves. Union Pacific has more revenue, $19.5 billion, than the entire city of Los Angeles. The corporate police PR campaign worked almost immediately, though. The governor of California was soon seen literally picking up trash by the railroad tracks and announcing more investment in a statewide coordination as law enforcement and prosecutors. Alarmingly, with no evidence, Newsom compared the train thefts to the retail thefts and said the train thefts are equally organized and need to be prosecuted as such. Then a group of Republican senators sent a letter urging massive national federal crackdowns on train theft. So you see how this just starts to progress. It snowballs once they start this propaganda campaign. And so we saw in a few days and in real time how cops, corporations, and media combined to concoct a narrative of panic around a truly minor problem compared to ecological collapse, rising fascism, lack of healthcare, housing, etc., which leads to repressive policy. Finally, this brings me to one of the most important threads I've ever written. It's about how corporate media, police, and the wealthy elites work hard to shape what problems we think are urgent and what aren't. Read it and think about it. I encourage you all to go read anything that Alec puts out there, because he has been incredibly enlightening for me when it comes to explaining how explicit and how out in the open the propaganda is in favor of police departments. And guys, it's also one sort of almost nuanced. I'm sure most of you understand this, but I just feel compelled to say it. I think sometimes it's just a little bit more subtle than we think. It's things like what do you choose to cover and what do you choose to omit. So it doesn't always have to be that someone is sitting up on a screen explicitly lying to you. It's what are they choosing to emphasize? What are they choosing to try to make you emphasize and make you prioritize and think is most important? That's all propaganda as well. So there's like all these different layers to it. And unfortunately, the machine that does all of this Copaganda, as Alec calls it, is a very efficient one. And papers like the New York Times, which is still for some ungodly reason considered the paper of record, despite their, I mean, how many stories did they have to redact over Trump and Russiagate and all that? I mean, they've discredited themselves repeatedly, and yet still considered the paper of record, probably because we don't have anything better outside of independent media, which can't get the sort of institutional backing that the New York Times gets, right? But anyway, I just wanted to make sure that you all kind of understand that this is how these issues are covered. And stories, Alec has talked a lot about how stories, they'll fearmonger about violent crime without acknowledging that such a small portion of their budget actually goes to violent crime, without acknowledging that they are not very good at solving violent crime, without acknowledging that most of their most of their energy and time and efforts are put to policing traffic and mental health issues and things of this sort. So there's no excuse for not defunding police. There's just not. There's no reason not to. Even if you perhaps are more, apologetic to police as an institution than I am, to suggest that an institution spending 3% of its budget on violent crime and the rest on harassing people needs to maintain its budgets or even grow its budgets in order to avoid a spike in violent crime. It's just a nonsensical notion on the surface, as I hope you all realize. And that's the kind of stuff that Alec has helped to sort of bring to the surface. And I encourage you all to follow him.